This is Dennis Hazel, and this video is entitled Recent Market Changes, Trends, and Impacts. Let's first talk about factors that historically influence stumpage. Stumpage being the value of wood sold on the stump by a landowner. Well, one of the most important factors was the local demand for lumber versus local supply, especially for hardwoods. So that tended to be very important. So price varied regionally and across the state a great deal historically. Then local mill capacity relative to the demand especially influenced local stumpage prices. And although I don't have it on this video, I've oftentimes shown a graph where I have graphed pulpwood prices for the 14 southeastern states over the last 20 or 25 years. And North Carolina is for almost every year on the bottom of the value per ton that a landowner receives for pulpwood. Why is that? If you look at a map of pulp mills in the southeast, you'll see that North Carolina has relatively few pulp mills relative to other states. That is, we have less local mill capacity for pulpwood, and that influences stumpage prices. There also have been and continue to be changes in taste for things like paneling, flooring. So some periods white oak is in, then it's red oak is in for furniture, for cabinetry. But again, historically it tended to be a very locally influenced supply and demand set of factors that tended to influence stumpage, whereas today's factors are much more complex. You hear terms, and it's not just for forestry and forest markets, it certainly includes them. You hear terms like health of the global economy, global supply, global demand, value of the U.S. dollar relative to other currencies. And those are huge factors, but we still want to remember that despite national and global factors, local supply versus local demand is still important and very often a big factor. So now let's look at a few well-known recent factors. Perhaps the greatest and most talked about in the forest products industry is the downturn in the national economy that was reflected in the changes in housing starts that occurred. So this graph that you're looking at which you're looking, I should say, has as the blue graph line single-family housing starts. And graphed in the blue vertical bars are various market recessions that happened in the country, the general markets. And if you look at the behavior of both of these lines, you'll see that there were drops in the housing starts with each of those recessions, and the later and third blue bar and longest or widest blue bar was the recent housing bubble burst that occurred, and with that the greatest reduction in housing starts that we've seen. And I put a few bullets in the top of the slide to indicate some national impacts. The housing starts dropped during this latest downturn period up to 75%. Again, this is national figure. Lumber production dropped 40%, and softwood, which means basically pine, stumpage value, is what the landowners get, dropped by 50%. This map shows loss of jobs in the forestry sector, and you can see states that lost at least 10,000 jobs or more, graphed in red. And you look at North Carolina, here we are here, We're unfortunately for this, a red state from this particular perspective. And I think that's between 2005 and 2009, I believe is correct for this map. However, it's not all bad news. Wood exports from North Carolina for a variety of purposes have been increasing, and you can see that the general trend for these various categories of forest products, wood pulp, wood, paper, has been increasing. It's also been diversifying. If you go to the port of Wilmington today, Wilmington is largely a container port, and in those containers going over the ocean now out of Wilmington are containers full of boards or lumber that has been sawn or maybe sawn and not planed that are going overseas. Some of the containers actually have logs in them that are going overseas. There's also a pellet export market that's out of both Wilmington and Morehead City going, and we'll talk more about that later, but going for fuel for Europe and soon to be Asia. But you go to the port of Morehead City, you're going to cross the bridge to Beaufort where you can see the port. There are a couple of things that you might see there towards the port side as you're traveling towards Beaufort, one of them being a large chip pile. And that chip pile are chips, pine chips, that are going to the world's largest medium density fiberboard production plant in the nation of Turkey, going from North Carolina. You may see some fairly poorly formed pine trees that are being loaded, and those are going for concrete forms in China. So we're getting this diversified and increasing export market from North Carolina. So that's some good news. But we look at the impacts of these market changes over time, and we see them as reflected in stumping. So these values are all on a per ton basis as stumpage, that is value to the landowner. The biggest money maker for most landowners is pine saw timber. It's the highest value, but we look at it over time from 2006, about the beginning of the downturn through today, and the general trend has been down. Pine chip and saw, which is largely used to make 2x4s from the center of those trees, you can see pretty much follows the downward pattern and the ups and downs of the pine saw timber. On the other hand, hardwood saw timber has seen a mostly increasing slope on the curve during that period. Pulpwood, both pine and blue, and green hardwood has generally been increasing over the same period. Part of the reason for that is in North Carolina there's been some repositioning of the pulp mills in terms of what they manufacture to be more competitive. That's partly responsible for that. But also the value of the dollar relative to other currencies has changed, making our material more affordable, and it's kept pulp mills moving forward and pulp prices to landowners improving. Now these data are from a different price reporting service. They tend to be a little bit different. They're statewide average prices. And I've just pulled some figures off from 2006, 2009, and 2016 so you can kind of see how things have sorted out from a tabular perspective. You can see that pine saw timber has seen a big drop, has not recovered all that much. Pine pulpwood and pine and hardwood pulpwood have increased, whereas on this particular one it's showing hardwood being less than it was in 2006. It's a little different than we saw in the other one, but a better story than pine. But despite the overall downturn, markets have diversified. So there's some good news. And this happens to be an artifact from a field trip that Dr. Barden and I took with this class several years ago to Alamance County to a very relatively small stand that was being harvested. It was only 30 acres, and that tends to be a little on the small side for forestry. And it was a low-value stand. It was not a plantation. It was a natural stand. It may have even been picked over a couple of times. And had a mixture that included some fairly poor form stems for even the more marketable species and some less marketable species. But because of the diversity of markets available to the logger and consulting forester who handled that sale around the Alamance County area, there were actually 9 individual stumpage products that were removed and sold, from including pine and hardwood saw timber, hardwood pallet wood, pine pallet wood, pulpwood for paper, fuel chips for boilers, colorized playground mulch, cross ties, and oriented strand board. And because of this very good use of the materials that were out there for markets, the stand was actually able to be harvested, completely harvested, very good utilization. The stand was replanted back to productive pine plantations, and the landowner actually put money in his pocket. So it's a good story created by the diversity of markets. But what about the push for renewable energy markets? It is creating new markets, but it's important to note that most of the important development is the recent development, that which is on top of the historic use for energy by the forest industry plants, is being driven by policy. Well, what are the kinds of energy wood that are being used? Besides firewood, I didn't mention firewood, but on a much bigger scale, poultry chips, which are made, and they're sometimes called dirty chips or fuel chips, and they're made from logging residues or small unusable stems that are gleaned from the forest during conventional roundwood logging. They would otherwise be left on the forest, but they're gleaned, they're chipped, used for boiler fuel for power plants, or for combined heat and power applications, such as using it to energize a pharmaceutical plant, such as Pfizer down in Sanford, or a poultry processing plant. So combined heat and power is where you get multiple uses out of the same energy. You can, for instance, manufacture steam and use the steam to spin a generator to produce electricity for the plant, and use the steam also for processing or cooking or running a steam-driven machine. So whole tree chips, also wood pellets, they can be made from low-value pine or hardwood logs, where the logs are actually delivered to the pellet mill. They're debarked and made into wood pellets there. But the pellet mills can also use the dirtier whole tree chips that are used from the forest. They can use some of those. Wood pellets in the U.S. were historically bagged mostly for home use. You buy them at the big box stores. But now large-scale manufacturing is occurring to supply power plants in the U.S. and the European Union to displace coal. So we will soon have the 4th large-scale wood pellet plant in eastern North Carolina. What about biofuels? You hear a lot about biofuels. Is it happening yet for wood? No, not on any large scale. And it's at $2 or $2.25 a gallon. Tough to make that work. Let's look at the contribution to the United States production of energy from biosources, and note that it really hadn't been growing at a high rate. So let's talk first of all about wood biomass. That's the color there. So now we're looking from 2006, these recent years where policies have been put into place, including the Renewable Fuel Standard, state RPSs. You look at the height or thickness of those bars, and what you'll see is we really have not seen that much of an increase in wood use. So it's been pretty static, despite an awful lot of money that's been spent by the federal government on research, in spite of all the policies, in spite of a lot of the hype. It's still not really growing all that significantly. There is one sector that has been growing in terms of the wood energy industry, and that is especially the use of wood pellets and manufacturing of electricity. So this is a little bit dated map showing in circles existing or operating wood pellet plants and proposed wood pellet plants and power plants that are being operated with wood, or those that are proposed to. And the main point is to note that there are a lot of circles and a lot of squares. And so it tells you that the southeastern U.S., whereas nationally wood energy hasn't been growing all that much, it has been growing the most in the southeast. Well, what are we expecting long term? Well, this is a graph that I've borrowed from Forest Consulting in Atlanta. They do forecast and supply studies for forest industry, including bioenergy. This is their forecast for the various sectors of wood energy from 2015 through 2025. And when you look at them, you'll see that only the wood pellet industry, which is in gray, is really being forecast to continue to grow. And it is somewhat asymptotic, that is, it flattens out around 2020, according to their forecast. So it's not something that's just going to explode and just keep growing exponentially. In fact, it's just the opposite. And the very interesting one is biofuels, that is liquid transportation fuels. This gets the most funding, this gets the most hype. The forest folks in Atlanta don't buy it being an eventual major energy source for the U.S. We'll see whether they're right or wrong. We've talked about pellets, and we've said the wood pellet companies are building in the southeast. There's beginning to be a fair amount of capacity. Well, what will these plants be purchasing? In eastern North Carolina, so far, it's mostly been low-value logs, especially hardwoods. Hardwoods, well, I mentioned earlier that the paper industry has somewhat changed in North Carolina, and that change has largely been that they switched to producing what are called fluff papers or absorbent papers. And that mostly comes from pine. So with that change is the lack of a need for hardwoods for pulpwood. And so the pellet companies, to as much as they can, gotten busy and purchased those hardwoods to sort of stay out of the way of the paper mills. In the West, like Statesville, new pellet plant, the emphasis for wood pellets has been on mill residues to use for mostly bags of pellets, where you would use them in pellet serves. And they may use some logging residues also. Well, I mentioned at the beginning of the wood energy part of this video that the new wood energy has largely been generated from policies and not market forces. And we should just keep in mind that policies can be revealed or they can be changed. North Carolina has one of the first renewable power standards for electricity production in the southeastern states that requires the public utilities to generate part of their portfolio of energy sources from renewable sources. So that's why they call it Renewable Portfolio Standard. It includes wood. And that's been on the books since 2007, but every year, at least through committee level, a bill is proposed to repeal that, which would let the utilities off the hook or maybe give them reduced milestones that they have to meet. And just remember, the pellet industry has been driven by European Union policies. Now, we mentioned when we were looking at the timelines for different kind of wood products, one called CLT, and this is a this stands for cross-laminated timber, and this is a fairly new industry. It really took off in Germany and a number of places in Europe. It's starting to get traction in the U.S., especially the Pacific Northwest, and now it's beginning to get traction in the Southeast. It's where entire panels are made from cross-laminated timber and then put together, and this could be a real boon for saw timber. So we'll summarize by saying that pine saw timber is down and will remain lower than pre-downturn prices. Same is going to be true for chip and saw. Hardwoods has been and will probably be a better story, but more variable. Pulpwood has improved, and there's no reason to think it won't keep fairly strong in North Carolina. Cross-laminated timber could be a valuable new market. There are much more that is diverse, low value in terms of dollars per ton for stumpage markets than ever before. Things like energy, mulch, oriented strand board, and pulpwood. And with that is the end of this video.